I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Kate Swann, is chair at Moonpig, the online card retailer, Beijer Ref, a global refrigeration distributor, Parques Reunidos, a global leisure parks operator, and IVC Evidensia, a multinational veterinary services provider. She's also a senior advisor at EQT AB, a private equity firm. Kate was formerly CEO at SSP Group plc and WH Smith, and held senior leadership roles at Argos Limited, Homebase and Currys Limited. Kate has previously served as non-executive director at British Land plc, Babcock International Group plc and England Hockey Limited, as well as Chancellor of Bradford University. Kate, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, I wanted to start with your experience of the board as a CEO. And one of the things that regular listeners of Enter the Boardroom will know that I still wrestle with is this data that suggests most boards are dysfunctional. Have there been moments where you have seen boards add value as an executive?
When I was an executive, most of my career was chief executive of public companies. So I did two big public companies, WH Smith for a decade, that was a big turnaround, and then SSP, which when I first joined was owned by EQT. And in the first year, we turned that around and floated it. And then I did another 6 years back in a public market. So most of my experience as CEO was in the public markets. And the way I would say, did boards add value? Yes, I would say certainly they did. Individuals particularly. If I think about some of the individuals that I worked with over that period of time, WH Smith was really difficult position when I took over as CEO. And then 8 weeks in, we had a private equity approach. The experienced members on the board, very helpful to me in that, to allow me to work through a turnaround plan, to give me confidence to be able to deliver something, which was not a popular plan at all when I first presented it. Everyone said, now, okay, well, of course, that was what you were supposed to do. For the first 3 years, no one said that. So yes, the board were very helpful. And if I think about the role that individuals have played, one of my favorite board members, he often used to come into my office and he'd say, I don't think I'm adding enough value, Kate. And I would say, yeah, but the value you add, John, is it's like I'm on a trapeze and you're a safety net. Most of the time you don't do anything, but then when I need you, goodness me, is it important to have you. So yes, collectively, and very much yes, individually.
I love that. So tell me more about John. What was the value he was adding as a safety net? Can you bring that to life for someone listening who wants to be that safety net for their CEO?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, he had no ego. So this is John Barton. Unfortunately, he's not with us anymore, but he was chair of Next for many years, chair of EasyJet. And he first recruited me. I was into the role of CEO at Smiths. And I didn't think we were going to get on because he asked me in my interview whether I thought I was up to the job, at which point he got an answer and then recruited me. And he was super valuable. He had no ego. He wasn't doing it for networking. He was just interested in businesses and doing the right thing and making businesses create value. So you never had to worry about if there was a problem, John would always be, okay, what's the right thing to do for the business? It was never about his reputation or what mattered most to him or having people on the board that were useful or in some sort of network. It was great from that point of view. He genuinely cut to the chase. His view on CEOs was, look, if you have to disagree with them a lot of the time, you need to fire them. Otherwise, if they're fundamentally capable, then you're there to support them, to challenge, but to support them. And he used to do that amazingly well in a very low ego way. So his favorite trick with me on the board day, he'd ring me up about, because I got in early, about 7:15, and he'd say, oh, I'm at the coffee shop over the road. Would you like a coffee? And I mean, this didn't dawn on me for about a blooming decade. And I'd go, oh yeah, how lovely. So he'd then bring it in and sit down. An hour and a half later, I told him all the things that I wasn't planning to tell the board. And then you felt relaxed and you'd opened up, and I'd go, so I'm a bit worried about that thing. And he'd go, okay, so what are you worried about? And I go, this or that, and yeah, he'd give you a very objective set of things to think about without telling you, oh yeah, your problem here is, or you could do that, or you could do that, and I suggest we do this. So he was just great at prompting you to think about the things that were either going really well or not going so well, but in an incredibly easy to deal with way.
So if I play that back, it sounds like when you talk about him being a safety net, what he was really good at doing was creating a safe space for you to unload and making you unload that things perhaps you didn't realize always you were worrying about, but then also giving you some frameworks on how to tackle those things without necessarily giving you advice that made you feel straitjacketed.
I'd probably say not quite as structured as that. And I would say the other thing he was great at is, particularly in public markets, not in private so much, but in public markets, there's what you want to do and then what will be acceptable to the market. And John was fantastic at saying, well, if that's what we want to do, then I'll go and talk to the shareholders. There was no sort of, that's not very popular at the moment. Perhaps we should do the wrong thing because it'll go down better. Yeah, none of that ever. He was great at giving you confidence to do the right thing, even if it looked externally not very popular. And that was the case in terms of the Smith strategy. What, a retailer choosing to lose sales? Nah, that'll never work. But it was the right thing to do, and it's proven to be the right thing to do. And John was, yep, you absolutely should do that.
So you've talked there about the value that an individual on the board, but it sounded like, by contrast, the board itself, when those individuals were together collectively, was less valuable.
I'd say it's different. The board is fundamentally a group of people. With any group of people, you're going to get some dysfunctional moments, and you're going to get individuals that don't optimally together all of the time. I think I've seen some boards that are more dysfunctional, others that are more functional.
When you think about that collective dynamic of the board, were there some chairs who were better than others at bringing out that collective value?
That's almost certainly going to be true because some people are more capable at that than others. But I think one of the skills of being chair, and I see that now, is that I don't think there's a little handbook that says this is the perfect chair. I think you need to use a different set of skills and capabilities dependent upon the state of the business, the CEO, the management team, the rest of the board members. So a great chair for one business is not necessarily a great chair for another business. I've certainly seen in other businesses chairs that I don't think are terribly good and ones that I do.
You talked about John as an example of a non-exec who really added a lot of value to you as a CEO individually, and you mentioned there were others. I'm curious to hear if they fell into particular archetypes. If we call John the sort of the safety net, what were the other archetypes that were particularly useful to you as a CEO?
I was fortunate. Most of my career as a CEO, I delivered the numbers. So the performance was good. And having a chair who fundamentally thought we were doing a good job was quite helpful. If we'd not been doing a good job, then I'd have liked a bit more challenge. I mean, there are some universal things. Personally, I think low ego is really important. It's about the business and it's about the team. It's not about a person. I think somebody who's fundamentally interested in the business and its people doing well, who wants to work collaboratively, who's got a degree of confidence such that they don't have to score any points. I think there are some similar characteristics. I wouldn't say archetypes. I mean, I worked with a couple of chairmen who I wouldn't say super soft, who were very gentle in their way. And I think actually at times, that's super valuable. But I think at other times you need to behave a bit differently. So no, I don't think it's archetypes. I think there are some specific qualities that make for a good chair.
That sounds to me how they brought the value to you. And a lot of those things in many ways to me sound like hygiene factors there, without which there is no sort of conversation.
That's because you haven't worked with many chairs, I guess.
But what about the what of the value that they brought to you? So if John brought you that safe space to unload and unpick problems, what did these other non-execs individually bring for you that you found really useful as a CEO?
Friendship, particularly if we're going through something really difficult, like the turnaround at Smith's or some of the tough days just from a amount of work at SSP. Because it can be quite I wouldn't say lonely job, but there's an awful lot of responsibility as a CEO, and having a chair who'd take a bit of that, not in any sort of practical sense, but it felt like it was a shared responsibility. That I found really useful. Somebody would just lighten the mood at times. So it was useful to have somebody come in and say, oh, wait, go home and eat some chips. And you'd kind of go, yeah, no, I should do that. You're right. Just a bit of care for your well-being, but also bringing a bit of perspective. I do think as a CEO, you can get very close to something, and a bit of perspective that is sometimes super helpful. Other chairs where they're very well networked in an industry is super helpful. If I think about one of my chairs at SSP, in fact, it might have been my only chair at SSP, he was really grounded in the industry, the airport airline industry. There was pretty much nobody he didn't know, which was super helpful. He'd say, so we're thinking this about this particular airport. And you'd always have a really valuable perspective on that. I don't think you necessarily need that all the time, but that was super helpful.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's a sort of, I know you didn't want to use that archetype, but someone who provides those introductions, that definitely resonates with a number of past guests.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I wouldn't take that. I mean, in the case of Vaughan, got lots more too, and he's one that now I sit on a board with him. He was very helpful in that business. I wouldn't take that over a bunch of personal qualities. I would take the personal qualities without a second thought.
And I suppose the other category there that I distilled from that was that person who cares for you as a CEO and helps you keep that perspective giver, that well-being minded person who provides the support that offsets the challenge that most CEOs face most of the time. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think also if you have that individual, if they have to say, Kate, you've come to the end of your time, which, I was fortunate nobody did. But I think it's an easier conversation to have. If you know that person, it's just an easier conversation to have.
And before we go on to talk about your transition from CEO to chair, just one last question on your time as a CEO. If you went back in time now, knowing what you know now as a non-executive, and you were sitting on the board where you were CEO, what value would you be bringing or look to bring as a board member that you didn't get at the time?
Well, remember, these were public companies. So I think I would get more value out of a style more similar to a private equity chair, where it's much more of a team. That chair and private equity is generally much more involved. It's less about governance and what can we get through the shareholders. So how much of the right decision can we get through?
It's really interesting. In the New Role Plus community, we host these sessions for board members and chairs where they bring challenges that they're wrestling with, and then the peer group helps them solve them. And we had one recently from a group of listed company board members, and the challenge they were facing was how to deal with the sort of listed regulation, governance, and all of that stuff. And what was fascinating to me from listening to them was half the group saw this as a massive problem, and the other half of the group wondered what the half that saw it as a massive problem were wrestling with. So there's this real bifurcation of how people perceived the load and the weight of being a listed company. Now, you've worked in both the private equity environment and a listed environment. I've only sort of worked in private equity and family-owned environments. I'm really curious to hear, having done both, do you feel like there is a way that in a listed company environment you can bring that private equity
Yeah, I
cut
do.
through?
In Moonpig, I started chairing that when it was privately owned, and we then floated it, and I still chair it. And the board there works much more like a private equity board. Obviously, we do all the governance things, and we have some of the constraints that being a public company brings. But yes, I think they're quite different. And I always said, when I was CEO of a public business, so long as you perform, you're more or less left alone by the shareholders because you're performing. And therefore, to some degree, the board leave you alone to get on. And if you're good and you're performing, that's actually not a bad place to be. And in private equity, you would probably get more push to deliver full potential rather than just be top quartile, etc. But as a CEO, I found that quite motivating. If I always deliver, then I can more or less get on and do the right thing. There was still a lot of frustrations around some of the governance. But I also think on the flip side, if you're an average CEO, it's much, much easier to hide in a public company than it is in a private company. So there's sort of pros and cons depending on what sort of CEO you are. If you're just okay and you don't work that hard, and then you can actually do perfectly well in a public company that I don't think you would in a private environment.
So for a board member listening to this, thinking, gosh, Kate, I hear you. I'm sitting on this listed company board. We're bogged down in governance, but I think we can become more private equity like. What would your advice be to them about affecting that shift in mindset? Is it simply about getting the right people around the table?
I would start with the board. It comes down to motivation for being on the board. Are those people there in order to really help the management team get the full potential out of that business? Or are they there because they've been there for a long while? They like to keep their hand in. It's a nice sort of social environment, and there's a bit of network and a bit of status. And you can see that, I think, by and large, through the levels of engagement, the levels of dialogue those board members have around the table. So I think you'd have to start there with the chair and the board, make sure they were motivated to really want to bring their experience and challenge and capability and extra hours to really help the business. I would then say, from a management team point of view, there's a bit of re-education around, okay, these people can actually help. And I know probably as a CEO, I was less open to that. I was more like, let me just get on with it. I know what I'm doing, with the exception of the ones that I've talked about. And I think if you get that type of individual around a board table, then management teams find that discussion really valuable. And I think about what I do now. My day today has involved discussion with two of the CEOs, one of the C-suite, and that's all been about strategic issues. So we're doing this. Do you think that's right? It's much more discursive than they present, I listen. So, and then I would say, so once you've sorted out the board and the management team's response to that, then the content of what you talk about, the board agenda, is really important. Make sure you're discussing the things that matter, the levers that make a difference. And yes, of course, you have to tick the boxes on and do the right thing on a lot of other things, but don't let that overwhelm your agendas, I would say.
You've built a wonderful range of roles across sectors and ownership types. What's been the golden thread that joins it all up?
For me, I like doing things where I can add value. I'm the world's worst networker. So if you're listening to this and you're a terrible network, don't panic. You still can do okay. It's great if you can network, but honestly, it fills me with an absolute sense of dread. I've never been to the Chelsea Flower Show. I've had billions of invitations, but I've never been. And so for me, it's always about, can I add some value to this? Because that's the thing that gets me excited. And therefore, I'm sort of sector agnostic. It doesn't really matter to me so long as I think I can add some value. And you look at my portfolio and think, oh, gosh, that's a really random bunch. Actually, a lot of the levers that you pull to drive value are really similar. So, for example, you would look at IVC Evidensia, the veterinary business, and you'd look at Beijer Ref that distributes air conditioning and refrigeration parts, and you think, yeah, but there's been a huge M&A lever in both of those. Similarly, you'd think in a number of those companies, revenue management, how you manage your revenue, how you price, how you understand elasticity, big driver across multiple of those businesses. Having a clear plan, you'd be amazed how many businesses aren't really clear about what they're trying to do, and therefore they're focusing on the things that are going to make the biggest difference to that. I find that, not universally, but there are more similarities in chairing these businesses than it would look like on the outside. And those levers and understanding those levers and having a desire to work out what those levers are more important than, have I ever run a theme park in my life? Answer no. I would quite like it though. It's quite an exciting job running a theme park.
We record Enter the Boardroom in the hope it gives you ideas that can add value to your boardrooms and help unlock non-executive opportunities. If you found it helpful and want more structured board-level learning, development and networking, I'd encourage you to try New Role Plus. Our new 6-month boardroom courses provide structured guidance from senior board members and New Role's board search professionals. Across 12 different events, the course is designed to help you decide which roles to apply for, refine your board CV and profile, network strategically, prepare for chair positions, master applications, and sharpen your board interview skills. To celebrate our milestone of 100,000 Enter the Boardroom downloads, I'm delighted to offer a 10% discount to all our listeners who sign up between now and the end of March. Head to plus.newrole.com and apply the code ENTER, all lowercase, at checkout. So I think the first investment I was ever involved with was alongside EQT when we acquired ISS. And they're a smart bunch. And for a group of investors like that to ask you to chair multiple portfolio companies, you're clearly doing lots right. What has been hardest for you in terms of that transition from CEO to chair?
I first met EQT because they hired me as CEO of SSP. They owned it and we went through the float. So I think you see a lot about the real culture of a business when you go through a float, because it's a tricky and quite stressful process. And at the time, I'd never heard of EQT before that. At the time, they didn't buy very much in the UK. And the partner that I'd worked with, who's now gone on to be, I think, ruler of the world, they then did a deal in the UK, which was IVC Evidensia. They had this veterinary business, Evidensia, in the Nordics, and they bought IVC over here and put the two together. And Per said to me, "Oh, would you like to be on the board? It's a deal in the UK." And I was, "Oh, I'll try that." So I joined the board and was on the board for a couple of years. And then the CEO and EQT said, "We'd like you to chair it." And that was the time that I'd announced that I was standing down from SSP. And I thought, well, I don't know if I'll be a very good chair or not, because I'd been a CEO and I knew what to do as a CEO. And I knew that you can't just repeat that as a chair because that's the CEO's job. So they were, "No, you think you'll do it quite well. You've been on the board a couple of years. So we've seen how you behave from that point of view." So I thought, okay, well, this is a good opportunity to see if I'll be any good. Contrary to my expectations, I actually didn't find the transition that difficult. I think I'd got the CEO bit out of my system. I had no desire anymore to get involved in that level of detail, which I thought I would. And I thought I would be constantly having to drag myself back from it. And there've been a couple of occasions, but I've been doing it now, for 6 years? And it's been a couple of occasions I found it much less problematic than I thought I would. And I have to say, one of the guys, CEO at IVC, used to work for me at SSP, Simon Smith, and I recruited him. And I remember when he said, my worry, Kate, my worry is that it will return to the SSP roles where, I am CEO, but actually you're CEO and I do everything you want. I was like, when did that ever happen? Full stop, Simon. But actually, we've built a really great working relationship as CEO and chair. And I think if you asked him now, he'd say, Kate's a great chair. Contrary to my expectations, she's turned out to be half decent. So I've sort of surprised myself, really.
So I guess that's a big part of it, leaving the CEO itch behind.
Yeah.
But do you feel that there are new muscles that you've had to build?
Completely.
And which, if so, have you had to work hardest at?
Well, the first one that I noticed was because you, as a CEO, you're very into one business. And then particularly if, like me, you do multiple businesses, it took me a little while for my brain to be able to compartmentalize. So I'd start a sentence, talking to the vets, and I'd then think, oh no, that's point's a Parques point. Your brain, it's amazing. Your brain adapts really quickly. And I don't find that troublesome at all now. It's like, okay, that was that conversation. That's that bit of the brain. Now this bit of the brain. So that was the first thing that I noticed. Then secondly, there's a whole different influencing style that you need. You can't move into very often okay, guys, I've heard, but we're going to do this. You can't do that. That's the CEO's job. And if you find yourself needing to do that frequently, as John would say, then you have to question whether the CEO is the right person. So, but you do need to get your CEOs to think and reflect on things. And what I have learned is people often say, so what makes a good chair? And I think a lot of what makes a good chair is understanding how the CEO works. So some of my CEOs, I can have a really direct conversation and say that I don't see that. I don't see the logic. I don't see how you go from there to there. I think about it. With others of the CEOs I work with, if I had that conversation, we would never get to the right point. And so you have to approach it in a different way because one of my CEOs is a reflector. So you'll start a conversation. You say, well, okay, we'll just think about it. I was just throwing that in there. I thought it was an interesting point. And then a couple of weeks later, you'll come back and he'll go, I've been thinking. And what I think is, and I go, yeah, okay. And it's just a different way of getting the same result. So you have to have a much broader, wider, deeper set of skills to influence, I think, than you do as a CEO.
You called one of your CEOs there a reflector. It sounds like you're categorizing in some way the different types of CEO you work with. Can we expand on that a bit more?
I wouldn't say I categorize them, but they're all actually, two of them are a little bit similar, but they would fall into three groups. So there's the one who's more of a reflector, will take on board stuff, but you can't go through the front door. You have to go round the sides, and then he opens the front door, and then it all works fine. One is very structured and likes papers, doesn't so much like the open discussion. So if you're going to have a discussion on something, give him time to write a paper, and then you can discuss from the paper. Then the other two are more driven performance, or not that the first two aren't, but you can have a more direct conversation and just hit the points straight out. So, and then I've chaired Secret Escapes for a while, worked with founders there, which again, I thought, oh, that's going to be interesting learning. And it was really interesting learning. So I think you have to, as a chair, a big part of your job is to get the best out of the CEO and the management team. And because they're different, you will have to behave differently, and you will have to supplement where they're not good and, support where they're really good. And they'll all be different because they're different individuals.
What have been the most challenging situations you've faced as a chair, and what can those listening learn from those experiences?
When I first started at WH Smith, I was really tricky. There were so many issues to deal with. I remember, because I think I started in the November time, and I remember standing on the King's Road before Christmas, and I'm a really good shopper, but I just wasn't enjoying shopping because I just knew the phone would ping all of the time, and under every stone, there was something not very attractive going to crawl out. That was really tough. And that was really tough because it was in the newspapers all of the time. Everything you were trying to do was scrutinized. And in the early years, a lot of what we did wasn't typical. and being robust enough to stand up to that, particularly when you've got, kids at school at the time when other kids are not necessarily that accommodating. So your kids come home and say, Mum, you've done this, really? And so that was really tough. And it's an interesting one in terms of advice. I mean, it's one of those things that, blimey, I'm glad I did it. But if somebody asked me to do it now, I don't know if I'd say yes, because it was really tough. And I guess, it's super, super useful. If you go through a tough experience, super useful, because most other experiences won't be as bad as that. And it's helpful to have got those scars, and it makes you more empathetic, and you develop a robustness and a resilience that's really useful. I listened to a podcast about happiness, and it's about the expectation. If your expectation is it's going to be absolutely grim, and it's a little bit less grim than that, you feel quite happy. So no, I wouldn't shy away from those, but I'd have gone in with my eyes way wider open than I did. So that was a really tough time. There've been times where the quantity of work has generally feel, it takes a lot for me to feel like I'm at capacity. There have been times where I felt, oh my gosh, I am at capacity. I'm having to choose not to do things that I need to do. Those have been really difficult. And that, I think I've learned through that, you just have to be rigorous with your prioritization and not worry so much. So hence why I've never done a Chelsea Flower show. If it wasn't family and it didn't put a pound in the till, then I wasn't going to do it. And people are like, okay. It's not popular as a strategy because bankers, lawyers, etc., they expect a degree of networking, but I never did it. And I think that enabled me to get through the quantity of work, because that's pretty much what I did, work and then family. And I do think you have to make some choices. If you try and do a bit of everything, you just won't do anything that well.
As a CEO, one of the most useful articles I've come across is how the top performing CEOs spend their time, which is in HBR. And it was an eye-opener for me. I suddenly realized I wasn't spending enough time on strategy, and I now have Fridays clear to just think about strategy. How do you think about allocating your time now as a chair with that ruthless prioritization mindset?
I think about it in terms of what the business needs. So I would say I don't have a set amount of time I'll spend on a certain set of things each week. I'll take a view on what I think the business needs at a moment in time, whether that's thinking about issues of today, issues of next year, issues of 2 or 3 years down the line. And I'll try and shape my time according to where the most value can be created. So if the strategy is really clear for the next few years, and I don't think there are any risks to that, then a lot of it will be on execution. If I think actually we're executing, but we're not looking where the ship's going enough, then I will try and allocate my time. Pretty much everything I do is driven by what's going to create the value. That's always been my rule of thumb.
Can you bring that to life with an example? At Beijer, the company had expanded through 15 acquisitions, I think, and notably into North America in January 2023. And in a previous episode of Enter the Boardroom, John Allen talked about his lessons from Tesco's failed entry into the US, where he suggested they failed because they assumed the same model would work in a different market and did not have a clear enough right to win. Really interested to understand how you thought through these acquisitions and that entry into North America.
Okay. Beijer operates in multiple countries. It's very decentralized. So there's not one model that you roll out everywhere. I would say it's a loose cooperative, but when I took over as chair, it had very little central infrastructure, and it's very decentralized. One of the areas that was a clear value driver was M&A, because it's not a mom and pop industry, but it's much less consolidated than most industries. And there are some real advantages in being part of a bigger group from all sorts of points of view, whether it's purchasing, whether it's digital proposition, whether it's benchmarking operational performance, whether it's development of green product, own brand product, etc. And when I started there, it was quite clear that there was a really good opportunity in M&A, not initially in In the US, that was more latterly. But when I joined, it was very decentralized, and all the MDs of the various companies and countries, they did M&A in their spare time. So there was nobody who was driving an M&A strategy or an M&A bucket list or M&A action. So one of the first things we did was put in, a tiny M&A function, which consisted of one and has now grown. It was a clear value driver. It was done as a bit of an afterthought once the MDs had run the business, if they had a bit of time. And we really drove that. And one of the things Beijer is very good at is assimilating and adopting M&A, because it's typically not huge M&A. It's typically smaller M&A. The US was a bit bigger. We did a rights issue on that. But the principle of Beijer does not step in and say, we bought you. Now, here's our playbook. You go away and do that. That's just not what they have done successfully. There's a huge difference. It's a very relationship-driven B2B business. It's men in white vans or smaller chains that are buying air conditioning and refrigeration, either systems or maintenance from you. So we start from a point of, those relationships that have built up in those countries are really important. Now, there are some areas that you can generate value by bringing them together and sharing, but there is an awful lot that actually is much better done on a decentralized basis.
So we tie that back into the time allocation question as a chair. Clearly, your role in something like that is very different from the role that you would have played as a CEO. Can you just give people listening who might be sort of chairs or aspiring chairs a sense of how they should think about how involved did you get in something like that? How much of your time in that period was dedicated to these acquisitions?
I choose how much time to invest based on the value I think we'll get out of it and how it's going. So establishing a central M&A function, very involved. Going through the initial process of, what's the field of play here? What type of acquisitions work for us and what type of acquisitions don't work for us? Who are our targets? Which countries are yes? Which countries are no? What's the order? Which segments or sub-segments? All of that, I think I'd have been quite heavily involved in. And then the first few, again, you'd spend quite a lot of time, all the very big ones like the US, big entry for us, the US. But once it's established and running and working well, then you can pull back from that. And I think that's the way in reality that it works as a chair. Something that takes a good chunk of your time at any moment, because it's important, might not 6 months down the line. I would dig right down into the detail if I was trying to make a point. So typically that might be, look, we've not done a thorough enough job on the costs here. So I'll go down into, how many steel toe cap boots did we buy last year? I have zero interest in how many but I want someone to know, and I want someone to know how much we're paying and do we need them all? And it's that's kind of a cultural thing. And then similarly, I'll understanding a problem, understanding the diagnosis. I'll go, I understand that's what you think. Show me the data that supports that. Where did we learn that? Right back into because you've had a couple of goes at solving it, you really do want to focus on making sure the diagnosis of that, your understanding of what causes that problem is thorough. And I will push the team to do that. Now, would I do that on everything? No. And I wouldn't want to, but you're trying to make a point, I think.
My guess is you operated somewhat like that, or at least I feel like I operate somewhat like that as a CEO, where I will deep dive on particular areas to sort of audit almost the quality of what's going on. But as soon as possible, I'm looking to delegate it to functional leads or business leads and stuff like that. So how is the way that you're doing that as a chair different from the way that you were doing that as a CEO? Because when you say you were very involved in that M&A setup, were you interviewing the prospective candidates alongside the CEO?
At that particular point in time, we were changing the CEO in Beijer. So there was a requirement for me to do that. If I was having the discussion on diagnosis and making sure our data is really robust on diagnosis, I would do that by and large through the CEO. Now, in some of the circumstances, the CEO will say, okay, so I think we've got there. Before so-and-so comes to the board, can we take you through, before they get to the written paper, this is our thinking. What do you think? And that's where I think CEOs and management teams who are open, you can get a lot of value out of board members who've probably been through these sorts of loops before. it would always be through the CEO unless we were planning to do something different with the CEO because they weren't capable.
When you differentiate between the way that you do that as a CEO and that sort of stepping back and diving in, how do you draw that line between the way you do it as a chair versus the way you do it as a CEO? Is it a question of proportion, degrees, times, that you're sort of, as a chair, you're spending 10 hours and stepping back, whereas as a CEO, you're spending 20 hours and stepping back?
When you ask the question, you have to then give it to the CEO and say, okay, look, is that a valuable question? In which case you need to take that forward. I'm not going to tell you, okay, get this person in the room, get that person in the room, we need this, etc. That is not my job to do the how you do that. But the discussion we should have, is it reasonable to want that? If it is, then over to you.
Time is flying by, which means it's almost time for the lightning round. Before we go on to that, I just want to ask one last question for you. You strike me as someone who's got a very strong growth mindset. You're constantly hungry to learn, sort of high performance mindset. What are you doing as a chair now on the personal development front to make sure that you're getting better as a chair?
The reason I really like having high quality board members is you always get to learn from them. Somebody once told me, in a room of people, there'll be something that every single person there does better than you. I have found that to be absolutely the case. So I think it's great to be able to learn from all of the people that I work with. And I really like to have capable CEOs and management teams because they're also really good at learning from. Over and above that, I am trying to do a bit more enjoying the present. I'm finding it tough, I have to say. I've been reading the book, but it's not coming naturally. Yeah.
Funny enough, I just gave the same response in another podcast where I was asked that question, and I said, I'm trying to learn how to be in the moment.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? A really good, surprisingly, a lawyer friend of mine, I was talking to her about this a couple of weeks back, and she said she'd really benefited from some transcendental meditation. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this sounds like a nightmare journey. And she was, no, it's 2 Sunday afternoons. And I was like, sign me up for that.
I love that. 2 Sunday afternoons and a transcendental
2 Sunday afternoons and I'm sorted. That is exactly my kind of plan.
Okay, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready. Best book every board member should read and why?
I don't really know, but one of the smartest people I've ever worked with is a guy called Neil Monnery. I've worked with him on many businesses and he's written a couple of great books. One's Safe as Houses and one is about Hong Kong and the success of Hong Kong. So I'd say read those, they'll be crackers.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
More than anything, the people who are on the board for themselves. So whatever issue comes up, their first response is, how's this going to affect me?
Most valuable board ritual?
I didn't really have one in a chair, but when I was a CEO, we used to do something called caring and sharing. So before we started the exec meetings, everybody would have to go around and care or share something that didn't have anything to do with work.
I'll be telling my executive teams. Favourite quote?
Somebody at the start of my career said, there's 24 hours in every day and you can do a lot in 24 hours.
Most significant professional insight?
Always do the right thing for the business and then do it as humanely as possible, but make those two things separate decisions.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I'm more generous with my time and experience. I want all of the painful experiences I went through. I want those learning experiences to die with me. I'd like to share them so other people don't have to go through them. I think I've got more perspective, which you get with age. So I used to sweat all stuff, small, any stuff I would sweat, hence probably the chill. I don't do that anymore. I sweat the important stuff.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
Work super hard as a board member. Work out how you are going to add that value. And then think hard about how can I add that in a way that's going to land well.
Okay, this has been a hugely energizing discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Pleasure.